on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
Shit's hitting the fan right now. The world is in some dire straits. And so, the elder is one who is no longer kind of concerned with their own well-being. They're not tending to their own story, maybe not even the story of their family or their community. Their vision has been lifted to a higher plane. And so if people aren't stepping into this work with a sense of, I'm here to give my life away, to pour it out on behalf of the world. And that might mean the kind of human world, but it's likely meaning all life, all matter that is here on the earth. Certainly, we need their presence.
What does it mean to be a man today? And what is masculinity reclaimed from the toxic paradigm of domination and empire? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential uncertainty, how can we draw upon the lens of mythopoetics to navigate the terrain of imaginal possibility? This podcast explores the historical, cultural, and contemporary voices that are once again realigning masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. My guest today is Ned Abenroth, a creative entrepreneur and wilderness guide who has spent much of his adult life tending to transformational spaces. For the last 10 years, he's worked with Illuman, a global spiritual community that was birthed out of Richard Rohr's work with male spirituality and rites of passage. In this episode, we explore the distinction between merely growing older and becoming an elder, as well the cultural gap that has left many adrift without guidance in traversing this threshold. Ned reflects on his personal experiences with grief and illness, having survived an encounter with cancer that reoriented death as a teacher. He shares insights from creating the Illuman Elder Rites of Passage program and the role of myth in orienting elderhood, not as a solitary journey, but one rooted in community, relationality, and service to future generations. A heads up, you are welcome to check out my website to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as how to become a paid Substack supporter. I don't accept advertising and rely on listeners like you to fund the show. Visit themythicmasculine.com for details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Ned Abenroth. Welcome, Ned, to the show.
Thanks so much, Ian. It's good to be here.
Could you share a little of where you are in this moment, geographically, emotionally, just to attune the listener?
Yeah. Well, my body is right now in Escondido, California, which is not too far from a battlefield that was kind of a pivotal moment in the Mexican-American War. My heart is often, though, up in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm born and raised. I've only been living down here for about a year and a half, almost 2 years now. And so there's that interesting juxtaposition between where your body is, where your heart is. Increasingly each day, I'm finding this to be a new home for me. But I guess we get to have many homes in our lives.
So this conversation is going to circle largely on the topic of elder. And before we jump in, I wanted to ask that first question to you as one who's steeped in this conversation and this effort to bring about and to wonder about elder and eldering. And so I think it's important perhaps for the listener to perhaps hear your definition to start. What is an elder?
Yeah, and it is strange to be not an elder. I consider myself just an adult, to be one who's kind of providing some definition, but such is the place in which I find myself. And I'm not sure that I would land on any one particular, but I could kind of describe at it in different ways. Obviously, we could make a separation between the elder as a role within a community, which often when an elder is a role in a community, it's elder in name only. It's not necessarily that person has arrived developmentally whether that be spiritually or psychologically or maybe even age-wise. They're playing the role of an elder. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And then there's the notion of an elder from a human developmental perspective. And some of the things that I think demarcate when somebody is crossed into elderhood is that they've no longer are focusing primarily, and by the way, I'm assuming that this means that the person is already a healthy adult, because you can't really jump from adolescence to elderhood, right? And the reality of the situation is we don't have all that many healthy adults in the world right now, particularly in the West. We have largely an adolescent society. And I'm not talking about eldering in terms of an age. We're not talking about people who have grown long in the tooth and, gray hairs and so forth. There's certainly plenty of old people who are rather juvenile. And I don't mean that necessarily I don't say that in a judgmental way. There's nothing wrong with being juvenile. If that's the stage you're in, then you've got the work of that stage to do. But for some reason, and I guess we'll get into that later, our culture seems to have allowed and even encouraged people to stay at some of those younger levels of maturation and not kind of step into adulthood and then eventually into elderhood. So some of this definition that I'll be giving you, I guess, is presumptive that they've already been doing a fair amount of inner work over the course of their life. And it could be that an elder could be somebody who is younger and developmentally, they happen to be a unique soul. That would be even more rare. We have so few elders already as it is. But I would say that elders, they've no longer are primarily concerned with transformational action in the world. And they are now, there's kind of an asymmetric priority or a bias towards transformational presence. So if you were to think of this, it's not that it's, one is over and the other begins. Rather than action, it's more about being in presence.
So let me jump in there too for a second, because you're laying out some great groundwork here. And I think, one, I wanted to bring forth to the conversation that what I will be offering alongside this wondering is my decade or so with a teacher, Stephen Jenkinson,
sure,
who has, he wrote a book called Come of Age, The Case for Elderhood in a Time of Trouble. And so, oh, great. And I'm just saying I've been steeped in at least his take on things. And I think that there's a lot that you might agree with, at least even reading the description on the Elder Rites of Passage of the, Rites of Passage program that you've founded. And one thing that I think there would be agreement on is that elderhood, or the capacity to elder, isn't a function of just getting older, right? It doesn't automatically happen. And I think that's one of the assumptions in this culture, is that just by getting older, you somehow are able to understand and to serve the function of eldering, because oftentimes it's just understood as an identity. Right. This is something I think you just, you spoke to a bit earlier there, that, people might say, oh yeah, the elders in the community. And by that, generally they mean the older folk in the community, right? That can be often shorthand. But I think what we're talking about here specifically, and what may be better understood in the context of a function, is that to elder is just that. It's not so much an identity. It's more it's a function within a healthy ecosystem of human culture.
Yes.
Yeah, and like you've said there as well, that the idea that one can go from an adolescent stage and skip adulthood into elderhood, right, is actually, they have to actually be able to proceed through those stages through the necessity of psychological development and maybe soul development, I would say, right? And, for somebody else who might say, well, that seems like very specific in a way. I understand you've also been steeped in Bill Plotkin's work and again, like the journey of the procession, right? And that could be something, you could speak to. But I wanted to label that up front as well, that generally, though, there's a sense that, one, elderhood is not a function of simply getting older. Two, that to become an elder typically just doesn't happen on its own, that there's a cultural steeping and tempering that happens. And I'm speaking now within intact cultures, right? That this is the way in which a culture renews itself by having practices and ways in order to move people through the developmental stages. It may not have the same language, but developmental stages of psychological and soul evolution, let's say. And so without those things, we have what we have today, which is generally, if we're talking about in the West, as you've written too on your page, one of the poverties of the West is an abject lack of elders. And I'll just read this one line or two here because it really lays it out. This barren dearth stretches so far back, we can scarcely imagine what we're missing. With a few glorious exceptions, elders are the stuff of legend. Worse than extinct, more than lost to history, elders have been gone so long, the absence threatens our hopes they ever actually were. So I just wanted to lay a bit of that as well into our approach to this conversation, that's the territory that we're stepping into. And I wonder what might stir from you in hearing all that.
Yeah. And so, there is it's a little bit messy because the work that we're doing especially is I'm on one hand, there's part of me that is pretty confident that we're helping people who are beginning maybe the very early stages of an elderhood journey, but are not necessarily at the end. Bill Plotkin is very, very strong about this, that rites of passage don't necessarily create the moment of transformation. They mark a journey of transformation that has probably already been happening for some time, or they might begin it, or they might just be doing what you'd call work of the stage. So, but given the lack, to some level, you have to start somewhere. And so we're beginning with people who are desiring to even venture this journey, which is so beautiful, And I'm not one to necessarily always decide in that it doesn't even matter all that much. Are these people elders by Jenkinson's definition or Plotkin's definition or somebody else's definition? What I see my role is to invite people into the path and on the journey and cheer them on and spur them on and do what I can, because kind of the what you read off the website there, kind of the elder as the stuff of legend, we're so far from that we can't really wait for the perfect to show up. We have to begin with where we are today, But one thing that you touched on that deeply resonates is that for me, elder is much less of a noun and more of a verb. And so it isn't an identity. It's a way of being. It's something that you're embodying, and it is inherently a relational verb. You cannot elder on your own. It goes against the grain of kind of the individualism of the West, because in that sense, and you can see this, we kind of idealize the elder. It's this place of esteem, and it becomes just another kind of notch on the belt or, thing in the ego that you can do, which goes completely counter to what eldering is really all about. And so this relational aspect of it, you have to be eldering within the particularity of a time and place and people. And yeah, so that gets to it a little bit more as well.
Let me ask you this then, as returning even to some of your own roots, how is it that you, who, seems relatively close to me in age, I've got quite a few more grays, but how is it that you came to found Elders Rites of Passage program? I'd be curious to know in your own story.
It's kind of absurd, isn't it? Who am I to be doing this? And the first thing I'd say is, of course, I didn't do it alone. I somehow found myself caught up in a movement that I was able to fall into. For many years, I worked with folks who were going through the kind of the retirement process, men and women in their 60s and 70s, in the capacity of a wealth manager. I was ordained as a pastor, but I was kind of always just right on the margins of the institution, or often beyond the margins. and I picked up the role of wealth manager for about 15 years because I knew it was a way not only to kind of fund the kind of work that I really wanted to be doing without having to go to external fundraising, but also, at that period of time, wealth managers were more trusted than a person's doctor or priest you have a particular access to people, and the kinds of conversations that I was having in my office went all over the place. They had lots to do with things besides money. And one of the things I observed in helping countless people kind of over that threshold of retirement was how much they were struggling. And, you can take care of some of the, kind of the basic materiality of that process, but the soul, what was happening on the soul level, was something I knew that we could really not access within the scope of the work I was doing for them. So I was very interested in seeing something that would build, and I was doing some more additional master's work, and I knew I'd been interested in ceremony and ritual and rites of passage and initiation, all those things were, many years before that. And so I devoted knowing that this was, a huge need, I devoted my master's project to it. So I every class that I had, didn't matter what the topic was, I was trying to bring it back to eldering in some capacity. And then this ended up being my seminal project was putting on the first one back in 2018.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now I'm curious I love that it was in the wealth management realm that you saw the struggle that folks of this age range were navigating. And I'm imagining that there was something in you that felt like, by you calling for it, this is something, again, that Stephen has spoken many times, that young people make elders, right? Because you say, like, who are you eldering on behalf of or to? And in that sense, it's maybe not a surprise, actually, that one at your age, right, in your generation, it seems like my generation, called for it and instigated it. And that gave an opportunity for the possibility to show up, through this rites of passage.
Absolutely. So I'm involved, like I'll be up in British Columbia next week to do a men's rites of passage for about, 130 men, something like that. And that is really targeting men who are right in the middle of their life. And it serves as the hinge kind of into what we would call the journey of descent. This is for Illuman. This is work that I do for Illuman, the community I'm a part of. And in that context, I would never want a younger man or even a youth present. It would make no sense at all. There's plenty of these kind of experiences where, the person does need to leave their community and have something that is rather unique to that particular stage. But it was pretty clear to us early on that the eldering initiation type work was very different, and it benefited from the presence of youth. And so one of the very first things we do, first of all, we always try and have a young person there, somebody who might be a junior or senior in high school who's already gone through an initiation of some kind on their own, so they have context to understand and they're connected to the community. And then we have a young person young meaning maybe 40, 45, who will stand up and say that very first night, you are not here for yourself. You're not here for yourself. And we try and get rid of
this is to the older folk, you're saying.
This is to the older folk,
Yeah.
Because how could you not come to something like this, given the culture we live in, thinking that you're doing some personal work and that you're coming for your own benefit? I mean, that's why people sign up, but that's not really why I want them there at all. And so we lay out, shit's hitting the fan right now, with the world is in some dire straits. And so, the elder is one who is no longer kind of concerned with their own well-being, they're not tending to their own story, maybe not even the story of their family or their community. Their vision has been lifted to a higher plane. And so if people aren't stepping into this work with a sense of, I'm here to give my life away, to pour it out on behalf of the world, and that might mean the kind of human world, but it's likely meaning all life, all matter that is here on the earth, then I don't have any interest in kind of creating a nice personal experience that makes people feel good in that kind of way. And that's the role of youth. because youth know it in a way that the old folks are not necessarily. It's hard. I mean, they've grown up. It's been kind of they've been experiencing kind of the frog in the water as it's gotten hotter, as opposed to my son, who's 12, has his own share of eco grief right now at that age. I mean, there's no illusion, that we're in dire straits for the younger generation. So certainly we need their presence.
No, you bring up something really important, which is the idea that to elder, like the great heartbreak is so many that hit that certain retirement age, and that really the mythos of the culture at large, right? If you're talking about the West, the culture at large is, now this is your time to be a Zoomer. It's your time to kick back, like find your gated community, downsize, like it's all you, baby. Like that's kind of the tone that these folks get, have a kind of, I earned this, I spent my life working, and now I can finally do my own thing again. And it makes sense within when the consumer culture, because it's like, great market, to continually exploit. But there's a certain soul poverty there, of course. I mean, one, for the older folks who maybe sense like, oh, this, I get I'm supposed to just hit golf, once a week and feel satisfied. And maybe a lot of them now aren't, right? They're like, wait a second, this doesn't actually feel like the right thing to be doing when obviously so much is needing attention. But the other thing is that for youth, there's like a double heartbreak that, like you said, there's this sense of how dire the straits are out there. And there's so few older folks, it seems, who are willing to be honest, actually, about what's going on. And even to recognize that perhaps they're the most called upon, older folk, I'm saying, who've benefited the most from the last, 5, 6, 7 decades.
They've benefited, right?
Well, yeah, I say that. Yeah, and I even say that meaning benefited, like just to exist, like just to be alive,
sure,
right? Like the benefit of that. And it's something that, again, Stephen would say that folks that are on the deathbed, right, which he spent many time in hospice, and that was his realm for so long. And he said time and again, when folks were at that edge, right, he said there oftentimes would be this kind of existential terror that would arise, no matter their religion or their atheism or, whatever it was. He said when that moment arose, this existential terror would come, because he said there was a recognition that somehow they had been on the take for so long, and they never turned it around and said, wait a second, to whom do I owe how much I've been granted? I mean, spiritual power or not, or just to life itself. And so there's some sense that to reach the, golden age of say retirement, right? And then it's just more opportunity to be on the take, while the young kids are the ones getting arrested in the streets for, trying to throw themselves in the way of the machine and trying to have a livable future. There's this kind of complete abdication of duty, it feels like, right? For the elders actually to be the ones who hopefully would be the ones attuned to life and what life needs, right? As a core function, that in fact it actually isn't about, quote, them anymore, but in fact, as you say, turning to what's required of them. And I'll just say that there's a recognition that doesn't happen automatically, just like the threshold of being a youth to an adult doesn't happen automatically, right? Like so many people are like, am I an adult now? Right? Because there's generally no way of marking that. There's no culturally held thresholds. I mean, now it's starting to be more, and like, the work you're doing, the work I'm doing. But so many folks grow up and they're like, I don't know if I'm an adult, well into their 30s, 40s. And the same for elders, I think, right? They're like, am I an elder now? I don't want to be, because I don't want to be old now. And I want to death grip my youth for as long as I can. There's all this stuff that can show up when it takes a kind of, okay, that time's done now, in a ritual fashion, I would imagine, right? To say, time to close that door because something else is actually calling you.
Yeah. I mean, I lived in this world for, 15 years, and it does make you a bit nauseous to see that the industry I was a part of was all about selling security and endless leisure. Like those are the two things that we were hawking. I'll just to say it that way, which of course is there's just full of fallacy that there could even be such a thing as security, right? And what is it that you're trying to protect anyway? And then this sense of leisure. Now we have to just say, I mean, these are the messages in the culture, and so we talk about this as if this is what people's experience is, but the reality is that very few people in that age group really have that kind of means, at least in the US. I mean, the number of people who are really surviving just on Social Security and who have nothing, they're still month to month. They don't have expendable financial resources. That's still the majority of people in retirement. So we're talking about kind of, fewer people than media. If you watch TV or wherever it is that you're getting media from, you're seeing the usually white, upper middle class kind of, folk who are somehow kind of living this idealized endless leisure, which is just, I mean, obviously it's just a sign of, it's kind of one of the symptoms of a late stage kind of consumeristic, capitalistic, resource dependent kind of life, kind of society.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, you bring up, or I don't know if you wrote the page on the program, but I mean, there's another passage I'd love to bring in and then ask you a question. Now, this is around the experience of eldering itself. And so this passage here is, until one has been around eldering energy, you may not be aware you are holding your breath.
Yeah.
Once encountering an elder, a great releasing of something you didn't know you were holding comes over you. We are invited to a new way of breathing, of being, of living, of moving through our daily existence. In that passage, I wonder for you, can you speak to an encounter like that in your life?
Oh, I could name a number. I think I'm just incredibly fortunate to have had, numerous elders who have been and who still are close to me and talk with me and call me out and offer grace.
I'm imagining too, even as a younger age, when perhaps in your teens even, or 20s, and you had an encounter like that you're like, whoa, that shifted something in you, as the passage indicates.
Well, the moment that's coming to me right now is I was sitting with Belden Lane, who is an author and a weaver and just a remarkable, he's a retired theologian. And we were at a Coney Ranch in Goldendale. And this was right after an Elder Rites of Passage that he had been one of the primary speakers and kind of guides for. I try and not do that work. It feels like that part of the work needs to come from elders. And there was a young man there who was pouring out his life and he was in a place of full grief afterwards. There's about 10 of us in the room, and I'm tracking the conversation. And what's coming up for this man, I can feel myself actually start to have my own embodied response. I'm getting activated, and I'm like, what the hell can we do in this moment with this person? And of course I'm in my adult place of wanting to do something, right? Wanting to do something that can address the suffering. And at the end, after this long kind of pouring out, Belden just looked at him and he breathed he did a big sigh and he said, "There are no easy answers." And that was it. And we all exhaled. There was nothing. Nothing was needed. Nothing could be done anyway. And we had to release kind of our attachment to outcome, right? That like somehow we could actually fix it. I'm not under the illusion that even if we did have all the elders that we needed, that somehow we could turn this around. Yeah, on a global scale. But we might have a better posture towards how to hold the descent that we're going through as a species, and that all the other species are as well. And perhaps then something akin to the Great Turning of Joanna Macy might have a chance, But we don't do it because what Belden said there, he didn't offer it because it was going to fix anything. And yet it did. We did all exhale, we did all exhale. Now, I mean, what I put there, isn't that nice? I mean, in a certain way, I don't mean to, I mean, in a kind of a sweet way, But the voice of an elder doesn't just make us like soothe us. It also should stir us up. It should scare the hell out of us, right? And so, there is a bit of a prophetic edge to the voice of an elder that should actually make us breathe harder and open our eyes wider and make us more angry than we already are. So I don't want to kind of make the elder into this nice, gentle, kind. They are that, but they also have a role of being a truth teller. And actually, Stephen Jenkinson does that in a particular way that's really quite lovely, isn't it? He's not going to bullshit you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that example. And I feel the energy too with the scene, right, with the elder and then the youth pouring his heart out, and the part that wants to come and fix and okay, how do we do anything? And this is what I would say is maybe an attunement to that particular moment. Eldering in that moment was simply acknowledgement, right? Simply like, wow, there's no easy answers, is there? From that place of deep, I almost picture like an old tree, right? Like an old growth tree speaking to like, a younger, more tangled, but fresh youth, and how necessary an ecosystem needs to have, like, again, that full topography, right? For a thriving ecosystem. If it's all the same, monoculture, we get, I think Bly talked about the sibling society, right? You named it as well, the sense of the adolescence there. The quote elders or the olders is another term, right, that has come forth, which I think is helpful. It's just adolescents who've grown older versus elders, that they end up competing for the same things often, right? Competing mm-hmm. for a sense of vitality or youthfulness, when in fact, it's unbecoming at a certain point, because actually there's something else that is properly required of them. And you also brought up the sense of, it's not all kind of nice and soothing. It's actually can be quite confronting. And there's a phrase that has come across around this idea of elder as a whetstone, right? WHET, mm-hmm. like that sharpens you, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also a really important function, I think. And then the third thing I'd say is, you said, during this time of a great descent, that, I'm imagining a ship turning into, the vast waves that are starting to come on in the face of a storm. And for me, the presence of elders in these kinds of moments, whether it's like facilitating in a group setting or a particular ceremonial context, especially, that elders add a kind of ballast to the undertaking. They like, whenever things go a bit haywire within, like, say, a ritual space, and I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Like, is it going to go off the rails? And then I look around, and if an elder or two is there, and I sense that they're on it, they're holding it, I'm like, okay, we're good. Yeah, whatever comes up, it's like, but we're good. Not everything's okay. Yeah. But there's something around that, their capacity to hold whatever comes up, and like, I relax because I know, okay, we all got this with their presence. To me, that's a vital part of elder.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So a couple stories that kind of come to mind that kind of touch on the dynamics you're saying. So I remember, I don't know, a number of years ago, being in kind of my own stage of full grief for the earth, and, not quite despair, but certainly this deep ache that I think anyone who's paying attention hopefully is feeling. And I was talking to an elder of mine named William, and he's Buddhist, and he's talking to me about it, and he goes, the ship's not going to turn around, but it's okay, And I was like, how can it be okay? And he's like, well, in 100 million years from now, I have no concern that, like, it's taking this really long perspective that an elder can hold that ballasted me. I was like, okay, at some point, people will look back on this, the age of the Anthropocene, and they'll be able to tell the story. I hope, I do believe conscious life somehow will find its way, even if it has to be reborn. But so, a sense of ballast. That's that when you're saying that, it's like, oh yeah, a sense of ballast. And the other is, this last one we did, actually it's the second, a couple times ago, we did a rites of passage, and towards the end we were doing a ritual that started to go a little bit off the rails. And what was going is that the theme was kind of a little bit around sovereignty, and what are you going to do with the sovereignty you have? And you started to see the insidiousness of patriarchy start to come right into the room, right? Because, and it's like and it was almost like you were there is like a slow dawning, like, oh my gosh, we're, these folks are starting, and how could it be any other way? By the way, I mean, this is the world we live in. It takes so much work to go counter to it. So there's no condemnation. We're just bringing awareness that, oh yeah, this is still in the room, and how could it not be any other way? So these men were thinking of sovereignty still as what they could ask of others as opposed to what they could offer, right? And what the only terrain that they really ultimately have sovereignty over is what's inside their own body and heart, right? Their own soul. Like beyond that, we have very little control. And I'm feeling my own as I'm starting to be aware of this. And a friend of mine who's helping as well, we're waking up and we're like, oh my God. And so I go over to an elder who is helping us. Her name's Therese. And I go, Therese, I think, we need to do something, don't we? Like, can we do something? But I somehow, like, I wasn't stepping into my full agency. I was the person in the room who was most authorized to do something at that moment. But I wouldn't, and maybe it's some sense of borrowed function. It shows a lack of maturity on my own side. But it was the elder who, she said, yes, Ned, of course, like, what are you waiting for? Right. And then it's like, okay, so then we can name it. And actually I wouldn't change it for the world, because it became a much richer ceremony as a result. We got to push into a dynamic that, of course, we're all facing at all times just by living in the culture we live in. And so I'm so glad that it's kind of reared its head inside of ritual space. But it was an elder who was like, we can't let this stand. We have to name it. We have to just honor the fact that it's here. There's no need to bring shame into it. That's not going to help anybody. And then let's do it again, and some of the folks who were there did give it a second shot, and some hadn't gone yet. And they, but it was a beautiful thing to watch. And that's something that an elder certainly can offer in ceremonial spaces.
I hear what you're sharing there as well, that it's almost like you needed the elder confirmation, right? Which is as a younger, and I see that as a beautiful thing too, right? To say, wait, my instinct's coming up. I wonder about this. And you kind of do a check, and they're like, yeah, you're right. Get in there. So, I think that's also a function of a kind of blessing, right? Yep. I needed the blessing and the confirmation that, yes, you're empowered to do so, rather than a weakness, I guess what I'm saying, right? That a moment of check-in maybe is a beautiful thing, right? To say, yeah, that's on you. Get in there. Yeah. And then shifting gears a little bit too. I mean, you're speaking now in different ways about the actual rite of passage, but I would love to know if you could kind of sketch it in what does feel, open to be shared. Perhaps there's certain things as well that are, held within the container as private, but if you would be open to sketching, how do you approach actually crafting an elder rites of passage? I'd be curious to hear.
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing I did is I read everything on the topic that was out there. And Aging Disaging still, I think, is like one of the kind of the premier books on it. Since I did all this work, I think the other book that came along that actually just confirmed everything that we've been doing, and really is like, wow, this is like, it's almost like they were, it's almost like she was here, was the book Roll to Soul by Connie Zweig. And so when I say that, it's just to say that it's not like some secret, like the process, like what we're going through it's no mystery. I mean, I would say that in any rite of passage, you have to be, before the rite of passage, you have to be at a place where the old answers are stale in the mouth. And you're now once again in a place with more questions than you have answers. And there's cracks in the edifice of like how you were being in the world, and it's falling apart. And you can't abide that way any longer, not because it's wrong, because it's just the clothes no longer fit. And so there's something, there needs to be desire. It's like you can't just step into this because, somebody kind of invited you. Like there is a sense of, are you ready? And I would just say, put it in broad strokes. We start by looking backward. looking at all that has been in your life and in the what you've inherited from those who've come before. And with that, of course, comes some need for healing, some need for, and certainly need for grief. And you're doing that not as a walk down memory lane. I mean, that's because it's not indulgent. It's not indulgent. So you're not looking back at the past because that's what, oh, let's open the old photo album. No, you're trying to harvest and distill the essence of what has been as a launch pad for who, not who you are to be, or how you are to be, but something like that in this next stage. What are the hints of how it's pointing you? Because everyone, and I don't want to talk about eldering monolithically. It's going to show up in diverse flowering within every human soul. So, and then we look forward. We look to death and dying and aging. And I mean, you kind of brushed up on this already, but I completely agree. We live in a kind of an aging phobic and a health oriented, stay young, don't die. I was graced enough to have had my own kind of near death experience and almost died. So I've gone down that journey, which probably helped me be able to kind of relate to what elders are going through, because I've stood on the threshold myself. And that's a powerful, powerful day. And you're tending not only to, of course, the death of the body, but also the death of all your roles, the death of all your tightly held ideas, all these things you found identity in. It's time to do a big garage sale and let it go. And we do, even by the end, Oconee Ranch, which is outside of Goldendale, where we hold them here in Washington. And we hold them in other places, but so we don't do this everywhere. But at Oconee, they happen to have one of the only wilderness burial graveyards in the U.S. that's fully They have about 1,200 acres, and about 40 of them have been set aside for wilderness burial. And so we spend half the day in the graveyard. It's actually not morose at all. I mean, people think of death work that this is going to be depressing, and why do I want to the paradox is that the more you do death work, the more vitality you end up with. I mean, and the senses are sharper, food tastes more intense, the colors are brighter. You actually can, that low level anxiety that kind of hums in the body of people who live in the West. Once you do death work, it actually, like, you get something that is akin to equanimity, and that's why I think the healthiest cultures in the world are those that are doing death work regularly, right? Now, this should be done by everybody at all stages of development, not just elders. But it does shift, because we somehow are able to delude ourselves that my death is, still years off. And so we're trying to offer a different posture. So Teilhard de Chardin had this notion. He was how do you describe he's a remarkable human being, right? He wore many things, including Catholic priest and scientist and theologian and so forth. But he had this term of hallowing one's diminishments, right? How do we hallow, HALLOW, make sacred our bodies falling apart? Okay. How do we embrace it as a sacred teacher? And so that's some of the work we do, is that you start to learn to, rather than resist it. I mean, oppositional energy is going to get us, really nowhere. If anything, it's going to make us, create its own host of maladies as a result of that, that tension that we're holding. How do we embrace our bodies falling apart and recognize that there is something in this process that is a deeper wisdom is at work? And when we look to the more than human world, we can see example after example after example. You and I both our home is in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. I mean, for us, it's the salmon, right? That's one place, but when you look at a salmon stream in the Pacific Northwest, you can always tell which, if you have two streams that branch off of a river, one that might be bearing salmon, one that's not, you can tell which is which just by looking at the greenery, the trees, because the trees over a salmon river are lush and green where they're going to, the spawning beds, right? And the reason for that is that the nitrogen from the adult salmon as they come up, they bring it up from the ocean, they feasted on, for many years out in the ocean. They come up, and as they die and they lay their bodies down into the salmon bed itself, or the spawning bed, and the nitrogen goes down into the roots and goes up into the trees, and the very same atoms that once were salmon are now tree, covering the bed. And of course, that's doing a couple things. It's keeping the water cool, which the young salmon fry need. It's also protecting from birds. And so you have this incredible image of multiple generations in different, stages of life cycle, even in different, like one's plant, one is animal, but it's all the same matter. And where is death? I mean, where would that be without death, right? Like somehow death is not antithetical to life. Death it feeds life. I mean, so all of this is stuff that this is kind of the work that we do. Sorry, I'm getting going here.
No,
We send. Go ahead. You have something. You have a comment. We're only about halfway through the event right now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it a lot. I mean, what comes to me is this capacity to see the bigger story, right? Like you said, with the salmon and providing for the soils and the trees, like that capacity to see them as deeply interrelated, right? That breaks the spell of this kind of atomized, individualistic, me, my body, my death, my wealth, my life. That I think is a hallmark of eldering, right? Is the capacity to keep bringing that bigger story into the culture and into the having a presence, right, within the culture that matters. And again, and it's not automatic. This is, the other piece of it, like saying, again, to become an elder isn't automatic in my understanding too. Like you don't just get there because you hang around long enough. This takes actual tempering and a kind of ongoing encounter, right, to surrender into a process, an ongoing ritual, a descent and return, culture making, right? All these ways in which that consciousness, in a way, can be renewed again and again. So I just wanted to highlight that. I appreciated that in what you're saying, that linking these folks to the bigger story feels like so much a big part of it, of this rites of passage that you've crafted. And I also understand there's a particular myth that has a role as well, which maybe this could be a time for you to speak to, a myth that helps to also carry the journey. Sure.
I mean, and there's actually a number of myths that we use. I mean, I think the myth you're referring to is the myth of Elijah. There's just not that many myths that we have. I mean, there's enough to use, but there's not nearly as many as you would think. Mythologies of the elder. So for those who don't know the story of Elijah, he's this kind of, old Jewish prophet, kind of a crusty guy who lived kind of a strange and rough life. And he had, I guess you could say, within his context and time, what might be something that resembled, or he might have thought it was something that was like successful career as a prophet, if whatever that might look like as an adult. But eventually, of course, it all falls apart for him. And he's got to leave his own nation behind. He's on the run from the government. He's kind of going into a place of exile, and he begins kind of a classic rite of passage into elderhood himself, complete with wandering in the desert for 40 days. But of course, that could have been 5 years or 10 years. We don't know. It's 40 days is this kind of symbolic number. Mm-hmm. And he gets, you have to, one of the pieces of that part of the myth that I love is just the importance of getting fully lost. As long as you're holding on to the vestiges of adulthood, you'll never move into elderhood. And that's really, you could say that about any major threshold, right? That you have to let go. So when he's finally good and lost, he's able to, the mountain appears and he goes deep into the underworld. He goes into a cave in the middle of the mountain, into the darkness, and kind of, the Jewish God like has his way with him in a particular way. And he has to sit and lodge there for, again, for who knows how long it was, but, and sitting with these questions, and he never is able to answer them any differently than he was, but he burns through the energy. And it's like, at some point, the questions no longer matter, right? That, he's holding them in a completely different way. And he does get, I wish I had time to tell you the whole myth, but in the way that I mean, kind of where you end up with is he comes to the mouth of the cave, which is right, like it's such a seminal image of, here he is, his back is to the underworld, the place of the soul, and up above him is the sky, the place of spirit and heaven and all of that, right? And he's right there in this threshold, and there's like an earthquake, and there's fire, and there's all, there's this great, all this stuff that happens, and he does not experience the presence of the friend in any of them. And then at the very end, he experiences silence, like sheer silence. And some translators have, there's a number of ways it gets tried to, they really don't, most people who translate the Bible aren't real comfortable with it being just silence. And so it's like, there's a still small voice, there's a gentle whisper, there's a blowing, there's a gentle blowing, there's all these things to make it. But it is true to the original Hebrew as well to say there was like nothing but nothing, and so that is a profound change in your spiritual journey when you start to experience the presence in full kind of oblivion nothingness, right? And he knew that this sheer silence, this nothingness, was the presence of the Holy One, right? And then, the story continues. He ends up getting commissioned into kind of a whole new season of eldering, goes down the mountain, has another fruitful season of his life, but he's no longer kind of the star of the show. He's a mentor, which is one of these roles that elders can play. And but it is beautiful. I don't think that we give ourselves enough permission to be that lost for long enough. We would do anything to skip that part, but it seems to be a necessary ingredient.
Well, thank you for that. How do you see this? How do you see the change of these older folks that come through the approach, and they're willing to, they feel ready enough, and on the other side, what do you see changed in them? And again, I'm not saying it's a quick fix. It's suddenly, you're different forever, but what is the perhaps recognizable shift that you see happen over and over again?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a certain vitality that rushes into them. By the final day, because, we kind of, that, which is totally fine. We kind of cut short the conversation on what happens there. But by the end, there is a certain arrival into a new way of being in the world. And men and, folk go back and they do seem to start to embody that in a different way in their context. So we've had folks who, they end up, they might not, the context doesn't always change. They might be coaching a basketball team or working with kids, or it might be, working with art. It might be working within their family. There's a wide variety. But one thing that we see is that they are starting to they have stepped out of their own individual story in a deeper way and are investing into kind of these wider circles. So Illuman is this community of men that has come out of the work of Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan author and teacher and kind of a remarkable man. And we started a chapter in the Pacific Northwest, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago. And what we saw as we, had men who were in that work, all of a sudden, it changed the whole timbre of the community. Because these elders were now reaching out to young men who were in the community. That moment I shared with Belden, because I could have said those same words. I could have said, there's no good answers, but it wouldn't quite roll off my tongue, right? Because as we said, it's about the presence behind the words. And I'm not an elder. So when an elder says there's no easy answers, it's like we believe them in a different kind of way. And it's the presence that comes through those words that holds us. So when you have that energy alive in a community, my goodness, beautiful things happen. So you almost start to see it, not just, it's like you don't want to see it too directly. To see the fruits of it, you have to look at it indirectly. You have to look at the people they've been brushing into, what's been the impact on their life, right? And that's where you start to see, I think some of the real fruits of the work. I mean, I could just say, like, as an example, these young men who are involved, my own son came last time, he's 18 now. And I mean, he points to it as a life-changing experience to be in community with these elders. And these elders still are interested in him and ask about him. And, and he's got men he can go to. I should just clarify, because Illuman is a men's community. We are doing the eldering rites of passage for all genders, but up until now, it's been primarily for men. So, and Illuman is men's community. So that's why I say, River has men he can go to. He has women elders as well he can go to. But yeah.
Thank you for that. I see this image of a kind of reweaving a tapestry, right? Of what I'd call it, like cultural fullness, right? Where there is a sense of, a natural hierarchy, right? As opposed to an artificial hierarchy. And this is something that I think appeals to a kind of, radical horizontalism can often miss, right? Because there's been so much kind of hierarchy of power over, right? It's been very wounding. I mean, I look at politicians, I look at, I remember seeing some interview or news conference with, I think it might have been Rudy Giuliani, right? I think he was a former New York mayor or something, and he played some other role in the Trump campaign. But the way he was showing up was just so petulant for a man of his age in this press conference. I mean, I was appalled, right? I was just like, I was embarrassed for him and just appalled that and somebody could get that age and be like that. And so I just use that as an example, is there's something around the abuse of that kind of hierarchy, right? Which has turned a lot of people off, like especially those that kind of reject a sense of, I don't want to be told what to do. I don't want any power over this kind of stuff. But there's something else, though, which is, I think, a fully intact cultural ecosystem, that there is a natural hierarchy that actually has to be there and actually is an enrichment of the culture, right? To not everybody trying to be everybody, right? But that understanding that there is necessary stages that different folks play at different times, and that, in an intact culture, or a culture that's finding its way again into intactness, that there's a sense that, you serve from your particular place. Like the youth, have a particular function and a particular role to play and a beauty to bring. And then adults do, and parents do, and then elders do in that tapestry. And so I'd be curious for you, what is the vision that you've been in service to for a while now, it seems, right? But certainly more recently with these elder rites of passage. But what is sort of the greatest song that could be sung, right? With all of this effort that you see orchestrating, that you're a part of, not the center of, but the part of, and with many others. Yeah. What do you see in the we need a plethora of people doing this work. And so we need to see rites of passage for elders and all of the other kind of work that comes with preparing for that and helping to integrate those things after the event. We need to see that in, every kind of community you can imagine. So certainly in faith communities of every religious tradition, could be local and civic communities. I mean, you name the kind of community, and we need rites of passage that are adapted to those contexts for elders. So what I'm not interested in is in taking the kind of the work we've done and say, we have the answer. It's not, it's like, well, we're touching on kind of a universal pattern, but I am part of an alliance of others who are doing this kind of similar types of things in their own context. And together we're trying to raise consciousness around this whole effort that is going to be something that's bigger than all of us, is what we're hoping, So, if I was to put it succinctly, I would say what you were touching on before is that, indigenous cultures or intact kind of cultures, whole cultures, often are highly hierarchical. But before the Industrial Revolution, elders were at the middle of the village, right? Mm. And we could tease this apart, like why this happened. But long story short, I mean, what we saw is the elders got pushed to the edge, right? And rather than being kind of infused throughout, they got kind of put into group housing, right? And so, one of the hopes, to answer kind of the question I have, is that elders would once again be infused throughout culture and no longer ostracized and put with people who are kind of their own age, but that they would be, kind of the leaven that goes through, the entire dough, and that has its way of kind of working on us. So, and that if that actually came to be, I think that would
change everything. It wouldn't be, it would probably be correlative to other things that were also happening. Because if that happened, there'd be a lot of other goodness that is rolling, right? So, may it be, and it can't happen soon enough.
Beautiful, Ned. I feel like we've wound down to the end of this conversation for now. And yeah, is there anything you wish to leave the listener with? I will be offering links to your programs and things in the chat notes and things after. But yeah, is there any other words you want to leave us with?
Sure. Would you mind if I leave you with a poem? Please. This is a poem from one of the folks who went through the Elder Rites of Passage. He's in hospice care right now. He'll have his body, part of his body's going to be composted. We'll be coming together sometime in the coming months when he does pass. And part of when we turn his body turns into compost, we'll be taking some of that to Ikoni, and he won't be the first elder who we've commissioned into the earth there. So this is one of the things we really encourage for them to do, is to start to write poetry. It seems to come naturally for people who wake up. And this is he just finished his first book of poetry. This is from one of them. This is from our brother Randall Morse. This man has been worn whole. This man has been worn whole and grateful by storm and love. Let him die near some who knew his flaws and failures and loved him anyway. Let him breathe easily into that good last breath which exhales into mystery. And, if possible, let this be in the company of some laughter. Remember that his friendship with darkness included a light heart. He was born in October, when leaves die in style. He'd welcome a departure in that same month of colors. But it could also be winter, when the lean-limbed trees await rebirth, or spring, when resurrections abound. He may die when summer warms the beaches, and the oceans sing him home. Let words that heal be spoken, and entrusted to grace and eternity. May those who blessed him with love and friendship be blessed themselves. Let all who gather or hear of his passing know that even in times when he was blind, he could still feel love gathering round him and within him. He had come to know himself as a man blessed beyond words to describe. He'd allowed grace to find him. He'd allowed grace to find him and lead him into the streams of gratitude. And he chose to ride those streams into the mystery of home. It's Randall Mullins. Yeah.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ned.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate for the work you're doing in the world as well, Ian.
Onward we go. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and share on your social media. Once again, you're also invited to find The Mythic Masculine on Substack. You'll be able to subscribe to forthcoming episodes as well as become a paid supporter. Visit themythicmasculine.com to learn more.